welcome everyone who's here. Thank you for joining us. This is the session on communities, social care and local economies as part of the Social Care Future Online Festival. I'm going to work through some of the intro slides initially, so welcome to our session. If you know someone who's trying to get into the session and they can't, please tell them to give Wendy a call. That's on 01214745900. If anyone needs that again, just pop it in the chat box and we'll be able to reply. We are recording all of the sessions apart from lunchtime breakout rooms and break. It's hard to get people's voices heard in video sessions. We know that, we're really conscious of it. So if you have something you want to say, use a yellow card. So wave something yellow around and hopefully we'll be able to see you. We'll be trying to keep this as much to time as possible, but the session will definitely end at 11:45. Keep yourselves on mute when you're not speaking. And if you want your video on, great, but also please feel free to have it off. We know it's really tiring to be on video calls all day at the minute. You can also have gallery view, so you can pick how you want to see people. You can have gallery view if you go to the top right, normally it is. You can pick gallery view or you can have speaker view. So it's entirely up to you if you want to see one of us who's speaking in big all over your screen, or if you want to see everyone else's reactions to it as well, then you can pick your view. The chat function is there. It looks like this. We will save the chat from each session and share it afterwards, and it will help us with kind of write-ups and reflections on what's been talked about during the session. So please do chuck any thoughts or comments or questions into the chat box as we go. We'll be keeping an eye on it. If you're having any problems with your sound, you can check sound settings. So if you go to it's normally top left, but settings in Zoom into preferences, you can check your sound settings in there. Normally it defaults if you put a set of headphones into the headphones, that should work. But if anyone's having any problems, again, either call Wendy or you can drop us a little chat line. So with the formal intro to the session, the housekeeping done, welcome to our session on communities, social care and local economies. So I'm Susie Finlayson from Power to Change. We've got a bunch of speakers joining us. Sian Lockwood from Community Catalysts, and I'll be leading the overall session, but handing over to our expert and inspiring speakers very soon, so you won't hear too much from us. We wanted to do a bit of intro to each of our organisations and why we've pulled this session together. But first of all, I will run you through the session. So Sian and I are going to do our intros at the beginning. We'll then hand over to Sarah, who's going to talk a little bit about local economies, Nick, who's going to talk about communities and asset-based community development, Tim from TLAP, who's going to talk us through the social care perspective. We'll then have kind of some time for questions and discussion and a bit of a break. And then we're going to have a bit of inspiration from Andrew from NWADAS around kind of glimpses of when local economies, communities, social care collides. He's going to talk us through a report that they've had commissioned. And then towards the end of the session, we're going to break out into discussion groups, and Clinton's going to chair that for us. We were going to have Donna Hall from New Local pulling everything together with next steps at the end, but as is the way at the minute, she's been called into an urgent meeting around a hospital. And so she won't be able to join us, which I think is perfectly understandable at the minute, but we will have the able substitute of Martin Routledge stepping in to do that bit. So without further ado, I think we'll get cracking. Sian, over to you.
Can you move the slides then, Susie? Thank you very much. Just I forget who I am otherwise. I think many of you will know Community Catalysts. I'm not going to go on too much about what we do. We were launched nearly 11 years ago now. We're capacity building, work through local partners across the UK, and our aim is to make sure that people who need some support have real choice of great services that help them live the lives they want. And we work in a number of different ways. Many of you will know us best from our work supporting local people to set up community enterprises that help other local people. But we're the proud home of local area coordination as well, which is a fantastic connecting model which enables people to use their own resource and the resources of their communities to take the steps they need to live the lives they want. We have a membership organisation called Small Good Stuff for our community micro enterprises, And we have just become the temporary home of the Coalition for Personalised Care. So that's us. Susie.
Thanks, Sean. And I think the slides are taking a little while to jump through. So yes, as I say, I'm from Power to Change. Some of you may know, some of you may not. So we are the independent trust for community businesses in England. We were set up in 2015 with an £150 million endowment from Big Lottery to spend down over kind of 8 to 10 years. And what we consider a community business to be is they are locally rooted, so they're really place-based, kind of neighbourhood, slightly larger potentially in a rural area, and they're really accountable to that local community. They trade in some way to achieve sustainability, so services and all kind of goods, and they deliver kind of community-wide impact. So they can be anything from if the local pub's closing down and the community buy it and then deliver far more than it being just a pub, to quite a kind of traditional community hub. And we're seeing increasingly community businesses moving into, or new community businesses starting in the social care space. Sean, I'm going to hand over to you on our disconnected conversations and how we ended up.
I know.
Setting up
This the history of this session really goes back to the beginning of the first lockdown, which feels a million miles away, and before that actually, where because Community Catalysts and Power to Change straddle sectors, we support people who are working in the health and social care sector, but we're also all about community, and increasingly have recognised that we have a big role in supporting local economies through creating local jobs. We were in an unusual position of straddling a number of disconnected conversations. And at the beginning of lockdown provided an opportunity to virtually join conversations that we wouldn't have joined if
I won't be there this week. I'm in a conference. I'll be there next week.
Just to say, people,
Right.
can you mute yourself when you're not talking, just because it helps us keep on track. It helps my mind. I can't multitask. So we were involved in conversations which were all about communities. It was all about the amazing surge in the mutual aid organisations and all the discussions that were going on about how do you enable all this wonderful energy and goodwill to be retained once we start to move into recovering from COVID. At the same time, there was a big conversation going on about the future of social care. Some of the fault lines in social care were being exposed by COVID-19, and there were some very big conversations going on with government about what needed to be done to support social care. And then equally, there were conversations going on about local economies and how we could support the local economies. And we felt increasingly, Susie and I had the luxury really of being able to spend a bit of time talking to each other, and we felt increasingly that it was important to be able to bring these conversations together, because we saw that each impacted upon the other and would enable much more creative and interesting solutions to emerge. So Susie, over to you. You're muted at the moment.
I am, you're right. Too many things for me to manage, doing slides and unmuting myself. Yes, so I think kind of as Sean's described, we really wanted to join the conversations together, or at least some of the people who were involved in those conversations, because I think where we were starting from, we obviously knew we can't kind of change the world, just the two of us immediately. So we really started talking to others, some of who are going to speak later on in the session, and others who aren't in the session today, but really about kind of the overlap of all these conversations and how it fits together. And I don't think we've got a kind of silver bullet of how it's all going to work, but we really want to spark more conversations about it and really start to try and connect them a bit more strategically and a bit more kind of routinely across the country, I guess. So without further ado, and because we are already running a little bit behind schedule, what we hope this session will bring, and into the future, is kind of new insights into existing problems, because those connections between those conversations should spark some interesting connections, that we widen our own horizons, so we start to think about it, those interconnections and interdependencies, that we can end up at a place where the money that is available, whilst it's insufficient, is used more effectively and has a greater impact for the people in receipt of support. And understanding around the kind of the impact that it's bigger than the impact for an individual, that the kind of additional impact we can have when we connect all these conversations up will have these better outcomes for people in communities more broadly. So I am going to stop sharing this and hand over to Sarah, who I think is with us now. Sarah, do you want to start doing your quick intro to you, and I will get your slides up?
Fab. Well, actually, Susie, if it's okay, I might share my screen just so that I can click through the slides.
Fine. We don't want next slides, please. Yes.
All right. I haven't shared my screen very much, so this is a bit of an experiment for me. Brilliant. Okay, that looks like it's working. Fab. It's great to be here. Great to be joining the festival and speaking to you all. As Susie said, I'm Sarah. I work at the New Economics Foundation, which is a think tank, and I'll be talking a little bit more about us as I speak in this presentation. So I've been asked to talk about local economies, and I thought I should begin with a quick caveat that I'm not an economist. I work on social policy, but I'm very interested in the intersection between social care and inclusive economic development. So I'll talk about that. So our view at the New Economics Foundation, or NEF, as we're commonly called, is that the purpose of a well-functioning economy is to support human well-being within environmental limits. And this was expressed by the economist Kate Raworth using the very creative metaphor of a donut. So she described humanity's 21st century challenge as meeting the needs of all within the means of the planet, which means that we need to ensure that no one falls short on life's essentials, while also ensuring that we don't overshoot planetary boundaries. So all of that means that the economy should occupy the space of the donut itself, avoiding the hole in the middle where people don't have enough, and the space beyond where we live in an environmentally unsustainable way. And this is a global challenge, but there's been some thinking on how to address it at a local and regional level in the UK. And I wanted to show you this because it makes a concept that can seem quite abstract a lot more concrete. This is the Thriving Places Index that some of you might have come across. It was developed by the Centre for Thriving Places. And confusingly, it looks a little bit like a donut. I'm not sure if it's supposed to, but what it does do is translate donut economics into a set of indicators arranged under 3 headings, which, as you can see, are local conditions for well-being, equality, and sustainability. And policymakers can draw on existing data sets to measure how well the economy is performing against the index. And that includes local policymakers as well, because the data is available at a local authority level. So what might policymakers then do to improve the performance of their economy? Well, I would argue that one of the things that they might do is to put social care at the centre of their economic strategy. And that's because social care has the potential to be a driver of inclusive economic development, or in other words, economic development that promotes well-being for large sections of the population in a sustainable way, while also addressing deep-rooted inequalities. And how? Well, firstly, the central purpose of social care is, or at least should be, to promote well-being. And of course, that's the social care future vision, which I've put in the centre of this slide. And I won't read it out to you because I imagine most of you are familiar with it. But while that vision extends beyond social care to some extent and describes the kind of society that we want to build, it's also about how social care can be a vehicle for well-being, helping millions of people to participate more fully in social and economic life. Secondly, the availability or unavailability of good social care has an impact on carers. And it's been estimated that there are now 13.6 million carers in the UK, following a huge increase in the number of carers during the pandemic, who are predominantly women. And social care can benefit them too. It can enable them to make freer choices about the balance of care, work, and free time in their lives. Thirdly, social care is a major employer. It provides jobs for 1.5 million people in England, and it's going to have to create more. Again, these people are predominantly women and disproportionately women of colour, and their jobs can be rewarding, but currently they're badly paid and often insecure. But social care could be a driver of prosperity rather than in-work poverty. And finally, social care is a low carbon sector. And if we're going to reorient the economy onto a more sustainable footing, we need to green production and consumption, but there's also a case for shifting towards production and consumption that's already relatively green, particularly if, like social care, it's of significant benefit to society. So you might make the point that we're miles away from all of this, that social care focuses too much on keeping people alive and not enough on helping people to lead a good life, that it isn't available for a lot of people and leaves them with no help or reliant on carers who then might struggle, that it creates jobs that, as I've said, are often badly paid and insecure. But of course, that conversely means that the scope for improvement is vast. And there's a particularly strong case for investment in social care and social care jobs at this moment in time. It's hard to overstate the impact of the pandemic on the economy, and NEF is one of many organisations calling for a fiscal stimulus to improve and create the low carbon jobs of the future, which in our view includes jobs in social care. So what can local policy makers do about all of this? And before addressing that question, I did want to say that in my view, some of the most pressing problems in social care do also require national solutions. It's central government that creates the rules that determine who is entitled to publicly funded social care and what they get. And it's central government that sets standards and puts funding into the system. And the issue at the moment is that, of course, those rules are very stringent, the standards are low, and the funding isn't sufficient. So we do need change to be led by national policymakers as well, including economic policymakers. We need a treasury that recognises its role in inclusive economic development. And of course, with the status quo as it is, the system is working against local policymakers who want to do things differently. But having said that, there are still a lot of things that are within their gift. It's local government that coordinates the provision of services, they shape the market, they can set a direction for social care that is supportive of inclusive economic development. And I know a number of local authorities are trying to do this, and we're going to hear from some in this session. And I'm just going to finish by talking briefly about 3 things that local authorities might do. The first is to set a strategic objective to shift away from extractive providers of social care and towards providers that create value for the community. This is a social objective, but it's also an economic objective, so it should be part of the local economic development agenda. The second thing is to involve local people, particularly those who need care and support, in developing an approach to this objective. What support do they get that they value, and what further help would enable them to lead the lives that they want? And the third thing is to be willing to take risks and to trial new approaches. And that means creating the conditions in which social innovation can happen, beginning with a shared vision for better social care and better social care jobs, emphasising the links between social care and other services like health and housing, bringing people together and supporting the development of new ventures. ultimately, it's about being prepared to work in a more collaborative and less competitive way, and to shift resources away from business as usual when business as usual isn't doing what we want it to do. That is it for me, so I'll hand over back to you, Sian.
Sarah, it's Martin here. Could you just tell people what you mean by an extractive provider?
Yeah, sure. So I guess at NEF, we talk quite a lot about providers that are driven by purpose rather than predominantly by profit. So I think an extractive provider is the opposite of that. An extractive provider is driven by profit over purpose. And I think we would particularly point to some large chain companies that have been shown. There's been quite a lot of research done on this, which uses kind of forensic accounting techniques that have a very financialized structure, which means that they're often heavily in debt, they're quite financially unstable, and they are essentially extracting quite a lot of money, both public money and private money, out of the social care system. So that, to us, would be an example of an extractive provider.
So basically the money goes to the Cayman Islands rather than stays in communities or something like that.
That is a very adept summary. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
Sarah.
Right, I'd like to introduce Mick, really. Mick is can introduce himself and talk about your background and where you're coming from, Mick. Do you want us to share your slides for you, or do you want
she's already on it, so you can share.
Oh, you see? Yeah.
Hiya, everybody. So I'm Mick Ward. I'm from Leeds. I actually retired a couple of months ago from Leeds City Council, where I've been my whole life. I was the deputy director there, a joint post between the council and the CCG. But one of my roles was around proliferating asset-based community development, ABCD. And I'm going to talk about our sort of experience in Leeds, but also what we've learned from working with other local authorities and indeed internationally on the work I'm doing now with nurture development. So I'm starting with this quote, which I know it eats up a bit of my time, but I think it's pretty crucial about why ABCD is so critical. So no society's got the money to buy what it costs to raise children, make a neighbourhood safe, care for older people, make democracy work, address injustices. The only way the world is going to address social problems is by enlisting the very people who are now classified as clients, patients, consumers, and actually those people becoming the co-workers, partners and the rebuilders of the core economy. And I would include health and care as part of that. And that's a really important quote, I think, for both those elements. I think the second half in particular is really talking about what you might call co-production and the importance of that, but actually going a bit further than that and moving towards sort of citizen-led, user-led activity and how critical that is. But the first bit is a real recognition that, you know what, not everything can be solved by a service. And I think about my own career and work, this insane idea that you could address loneliness in isolation in older people or segregation in disabled people by putting them in special buses and driving them 7 miles to a centre to sit around together. It was just insane. And what ABCD really says is actually there are genuine citizen-led alternatives to traditional services. And I think if you look in the next slide, what we're really talking is a set of principles that we've developed around ABCD over this sort of last 10, 20 years. So crucially, it's about having friends and valued relationships. That's really important to people, and about having the life that they choose and that people are supported to connect and share their gifts, share their passions, their interests, and very much do that locally within those neighbourhoods. And in doing that, reciprocity is really key. ABCD is not about promoting a gift model. It really does say everybody's got a valuable contribution to make, and it's a two-way process. And within that, not only the individuals gifts and skills, but what you've got in the community, the assets of a local area, are not just your traditional assets like libraries and sports centres or whatever, but that bit of space between the playing fields, that bit where people gather together outside the shop, the community cafe, all those things, and recognising that they can be celebrated. And it fits very well with individual work in terms of that, focusing on what's strong, not what's wrong, and recognising it's communities that are best placed to know what needs to change and make those changes. So in the next slide, we begin to think really about, put the next slide on, about what does that mean for a sort of a role within somewhere like a local authority or a big organisation. And I think people recognise the difference between sort of nowadays and the to, for, with and by. And what ABCD is trying to do is shift people towards the by bit. It's actually not saying that there isn't a place for the other bits. You know, if I go into hospital, I'm very more than happy for my surgeon to do it to me. I'm not suggesting I have a lot to contribute there. You know, if I go to a cultural event, even the cinema or something like that, I'm more than happy for them to put it on for me. You know, and there are some third sector charity organisations, I'm more than happy for them to do things for me. But generally, I'd be wanting to do with, and I know one of the big pushes about this whole event is about more working with people, and you know, the whole nothing about us without us type stuff. But you can go a bit further. What ABCD is about creating the space to nurture activities so they are done by people themselves, by individuals, by communities. And I think in the next slide, it really starts to say how somewhere like a local authority can shift towards that being more than a theory. And certainly our experience in Leeds and our recognition of working with other cities and areas doing that in the UK, Europe and internationally is to have a focus on two things. What you might call the more pure framework, but also thinking of it as a way of working. So in the next slide, we talk a bit about the framework and what we've been doing. When we started with 3 in Leeds, we're up to 14, our plan is to go further than that, is funding what you call a community builder in a small local community organisation. Other places have done it differently through local area coordination in places and stuff like, I know Joe's on the call, what they've done in York, in Bristol, where they do it very much through the council. But we funded small community organisations to employ a community builder whose role was simply to try and make those connections, to find people locally, community connectors, willing to share their gifts, whether that was setting up knit and natter groups, walking groups, reading groups, a multitude of activity where people come together to identify what needs to change, their common interests and so on, pushed very much by understanding what's going on in that community, locally led asset mapping. And that's that core role. We also give them tiny amounts of small sparks funding. And if we have time later, I'll talk a bit more about how that worked. But it was very much small amounts of money, very little oversight, just to encourage people to do things locally. We've had fantastic outcomes out of that. But also recognising the role of some local authorities to ensure there's an infrastructure around that. So we heavily funded training around ABCD, support for those organisations doing ABCD, and support for people delivering ABCD, because doing community development can be pretty lonely. And what we found in the next slide is 2 things were happening, maybe 3 actually at the same time. So the theory around ABCD began to gather, and this is very much from Cormac Russell and John McKnight, very much the leaders of ABCD, about what they saw as the functions of a community. And what was interesting when I came across this and shared it with colleagues in the council is they're very much what we in the council think that's our job. It's us who sorts out environment and education and economy and health and wellbeing. And it was a real challenge to flip that over and actually think that's the role of communities. But at the same time as we were understanding that, what we were hearing from the community builders on the activity that was taking place locally were impacts in all these areas. So, you know, community cohesion, things like the local Syrian kitchen doing food parcels for people during lockdown, walking groups doing litter picking as they went around, parents coming together to do education classes, particularly some stuff around use of Mactons, a fantastic example, families doing a play box in the local park, people coming together to share food, very much within a local economy. And of course, huge benefits around health and well-being, which is why in Leeds we funded this initially through adult social care. That's where we saw the really big impact and outcomes, so there's a cost benefit. But interesting for the rest of the council, and this is where the ABCD approach comes in, other directorates start to see the benefit. And we were never saying, yes, you need to convert every worker into a community builder, but you can start to do that. So in housing, they converted a tenant involvement post to move away from consultation engagement to actually work and nurture tenants to seize the agenda and lead things themselves. In sports, they converted a couple of posts away from working in a sports centre, working communities to encourage people to come together, but with physical activity being the main driver. And we've recently done a similar thing with education, where education have funded a post not to work in a school, but to actually work in a community area, working at cafes and places like that when you could, just to create a culture around reading and just to benefit the Cameron. And so we're starting to see now an increasing way of this being not just as in adults and health, but within the city. And I think that's been critical. And then finally, in my last slide, we've got a long way to go. I'm not pretending. You know, there's fantastic work still going on this, but some key stuff for us, it's a move away from service land, but not from responsibilities. You know, we still want to recognise what we're trying to do in the health and wellbeing strategy and so on. And it's also about services radically changing, some cases even ending. But you do need to invest in pathfinders, but keep it really, really local. It does need that infrastructure, does need a bit of small sparks funding, but don't overfund it. And key, this is about relationships. It's not the sorts of that easily fits into traditional procurement or project management. And you recognise that when you're trying to let 100 flowers bloom and not panicking when some will. Yes, you do need to measure impacts, and we're doing some really great work with Leeds Beckett University on this, which has given us confidence, even in these difficult times, to actually put further funding into this. And it will reduce demand on core things like adult social care and NHS. We've got increasing evidence of that, but it does take time. And importantly, it really fundamentally changes the relationship between a local authority and its citizens, and that's been a real additional benefit for us. Thanks for your time, and I'm looking forward to a bit more debate later.
Thanks.
Just unmuting myself to say thank you, Mick. That was brilliant. And to introduce Tim, who is going to introduce himself now. So Tim.
Hello.
Tim, over to you. Shall I share your slides?
Yes, please. So good morning, everyone. I'm Tim Parkin from the TLAP team. It's good to be with you this morning, at least virtually. So I'm going to talk about some of the issues at the heart of reforming social care. I'm going to start with a view on progress with personalisation, which is probably going to be familiar to many of you, and then say something about what the COVID experience seems to be telling us. Sian has also asked that I speak about some of the conversations going on around social care. I'm not privy to all of these. TLAP is not omnipresent, not yet anyway, but I will share a couple of areas of involvement. So if we could go to the next slide, please. TLAP is a partnership of more than 50 organisations. Our founding mission was and is to transform health and care through personalisation and community-based support. I'm spelling this out because I think it's really key to understand the idea of transformation in the context of a new social care future. TLAP has always been about supporting a new social care future, as first envisaged in the Putting People First Concordat and then later in the Care Act. We've always understood that good social care extends beyond eligibility criteria and should be about supporting a meaningful life. That's why our work streams have supported the wider architecture, commissioning for people, not time and task, building stronger communities, self-directed support that allows people to connect and contribute, all underpinned with co-production as a key enabler. We have been taking this forward through the Social Care Innovation Network with Shared Lives and Sky, underpinned by the central idea of asset-based areas. We've also pushed against silos that limit responsibility for social care to a single government department and or social care departments within councils. 10 years since the inception of TLAP and 5 years after the Care Act, the general reckoning is that transformation is unfinished business, with too few people receiving too little personalisation. Whilst it's now pretty well established as the accepted approach to care and support, it suffers from a lack of consistent implementation. The glass is not empty, but by no means is it full, and some would say it has been evaporating over recent years. Next slide, please. So COVID is further exposing the barriers that have held back people experiencing genuine personalisation, but is also showing the contours of a more optimistic picture. Evidence for this comes from a piece of work that TLAP undertook in the early days of the pandemic to understand the impact of COVID on people accessing care and support. We brought together over 20 partners through the TLAP Insight Group, the TIG, and undertook a rapid evidence review. This has been published in our Telling Experience report. Some key findings were people feeling cut off and left alone with little or no communication from their council. Others said they received confusing and conflicting advice. At the national level, people self-directing their support through use of direct payments were to a great extent invisible, at least at the outset, as were personal assistants. Locally, some councils responded by becoming even more inflexible by, for example, imposing restrictions on how a budget could be spent or even reducing it. There has been a huge impact on unpaid family carers who picked up extra care responsibilities when services closed, and as we know, a disproportionate impact on people from Black and ethnic minority communities. And one area that has been devastatingly affected are, of course, care homes, residents, families and staff. But for all that, we also found evidence of good practice. We have seen communities come together to look out for one another through the rapid flourishing of mutual aid. We've seen councils who have enabled people with direct payments to spend their budgets flexibly to keep safe and well. Providers in partnership with commissioners responding with agility and imagination to ensure they could continue to support people during the pandemic, keeping people safe and connected. And there have been pockets of good production, both nationally and locally. But there can be no doubting the transformational impact that COVID has had on and continues to have on our lives. Some of the responses to it have also been transformational. There are examples of achieving in days and weeks what would ordinarily take years. Bureaucracy has loosened, flexibility has increased, and communities trusted, not everywhere, but in some places. And this is what we must now ensure continues to transform social care. Next slide, please. And so to some conversations that are aiming to shape this. We are, sorry for any status quo fans out there, by the way, I'll just get that defence in early. We are beginning to see a coalescing around the basic idea that while social care badly needs investment, this should not be for more of the same. A couple of areas serve to illustrate this. Next slide, please. So a number of national partners, including TLAP, came together to submit a statement on priorities to the Department of Health for Social Care for the comprehensive spending review. And the fact that partners came together, I think, if not unique, is not generally the way it's worked in the past. Next slide, please. So as well as making the case for rescue funding to keep the system afloat and for long-term investment, it calls for early investment in change with targeted funding for prevention and asset-based approaches. It also supports what's called the New Deal for the workforce. Crucially, within that, it recognises that we need a workforce to deliver these approaches. The cash is not in the bank yet, it may never be. But the important point, I think, for today is that it shows it is possible to reach a shared view on the direction of change. There are tensions within it, for example, around registering the workforce, but there is promise too, I think. Next slide, please. We are also seeing this promise from conversations with directors of social care. We are just finishing off meetings in all of the 9 ADAS regions to share the TIG report, the telling experience. And certain themes stand out that are helpful to the care, community and economy agenda. Next slide, please. So some of the on the left hand side, and this is a high level of summary here, so it's a very strong distillation, but in terms of reflections, many of the directors were pointing out there'd been a very strong corporate response to responding to COVID that had led to a much better understanding of social care across and within the council. The response demanded a much greater sort of concentration on the local, you know, at a neighbourhood and level. That has led, according to some directors, to a much greater knowledge of the community assets, what's out there, much better and sophisticated understanding, and has brought the council and social care into contact with wider cohorts, often associated with the shielding. And it has, as part of that, uncovered some hidden need that's been hidden through 10 years, essentially, of austerity in relation to social care. And some of that need relates to BAME communities. In terms of the conversation, so what are we going to do about this? There's a willingness and a wish to kind of maintain this corporate approach. And I don't know, many of us will have been around when Putting People First hit the decks around this notion of universal services. I think Mick's indicated it's more than that. There's something about we need to continue that mobilizing the community, but there's some letting go, but not leaving alone. What's the balance between kind of support and allowing these things to flourish? Obviously, huge conversations about changing the models of support, particularly around day services and care homes. And then something about how do we respond to this new need that we rediscovered? We certainly can't respond to it by just funding familiar services. We can't afford it, and it's not the right thing to do. Equalities, less clear here. Everyone recognising it as an issue, bit less clear on the way forward. So to conclude with the next slide, if I may. Now I think is a good time to bring together the changing nature of social care with the ambition to create stronger local communities and prosperous local economies. I think now you could probably say you cannot have one without the others. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Tim and Mick and Sarah. I think those were really, really interesting, and hopefully it all connects up for people. We've got a little bit of time to open up for questions, thoughts, any reflections. So I'm going to hand over to you all because there's so many of you here. I can't see you all. So if you are waving your yellow card and I don't respond, pop something in the chat as well. But yeah, any questions?
Alison, are you waving? Unmute yourself if you are.
No, Azara, I think she's clapped. I don't know if that's a hand up, Azara.
If people want to talk, unmute. There is some, I've been monitoring the chat, and Wendy L has got a really interesting comment about health in all this and the role of health in the wider recovery and rebuilding of local economies. I don't know, Wendy, are you still there, and could you talk about that a bit? Hello, Wendy. Otherwise, I'll read it out, Susie. So Wendy says, health has a major role in the wider recovery and rebuilding of our local economies. Role of anchor institutions are massive. So health as anchor institutions, and ICSs, I can never remember what that stands for, need challenging on their contributions in this space. These are the integrated care systems, which are groups of health organizations in an area, aren't they? And they need, so really interesting, because we haven't really included health in these disparate conversations, and that they're there too, aren't they?
Yes, definitely. I think that's a good point. We've just had a comment from Kerry into the chat as well, that there's a risk at the moment that in times of financial strain, local authorities retreat back to what they know rather than continuing along this kind of innovative space and being more flexible. And it was something that I was kind of reflecting on when you were all speaking, actually, around the fact that we have heard quite a lot of positive stories about how some local authorities have been really flexible and innovative and removed barriers, and what it takes to keep that going in a time that's not of kind of the immediate emergency crisis that we're in currently, but under increased financial strain. So I don't know if there's any reflections. I mean, Mick, I think particularly from your experience, be interested to hear.
Yeah, and I think that can always be a problem when cuts, but actually, I mean, I've never been a fan of, the cuts are really good because it makes you think differently, but you cannot solve the current gap just by tweaking things anymore. The financial gap is so big now between what local authorities need to spend and the money they've got, that they have to do radically different things. And certainly, I mean, I know Joe McKelly's or Cork, you can talk about what they've been doing in York, but certainly in Leeds, we see ABCD, engagement, local economy driven stuff has been really critical. So it's my one bit of confidence in where we are at the moment. That and the learning from CV19 about what worked, about very rapid, quick, locally led, strong third sector, new types of partnerships were very helpful in the council in the end. So yeah, I don't underestimate the terrible situation council's in, but my sense is that actually they're not going to retreat to traditional. They're actually going to have to do things very, very differently and become what you would expect a modern council to be. And some of the things we have the speakers about further investment in digital, supported by digital inclusion, is going to be critical. But yeah, citizen-led stuff is going to be the way forward. But I always start with that quote to remind us that we're pushing that not because it's about saving money, but it's the right thing to do.
Kerry says to you, she absolutely agrees, Mick, but it's convincing corporate finance colleagues can be tricky. You got any insights on that?
Yeah, I mean, it is that simple stuff of return on investment, and what we've gathered, and it does take time. Some of this, it's just dozens and dozens of stories of those examples. In such case, the easiest one, you slow an older person going into a care home for 1 year because they feel more supported in the community. That's a £72,000 cash saving. Every one of those projects I talk about costs 25 grand for the whole year, for one area of Leeds. So there's very strong cash efficiencies within that, particularly in social care, but we're seeing them within increased active life through sports rather than doing it in very expensive sports centres. So yeah, you have to use a mixture of the individual stories backed with that longer term tracking about where we're spending money and trying to see that different. It's not easy because proving cause and effect in early intervention, as we know, is a challenge, but there's an increasing evidence base for it.
Have we time for one more question?
I was just looking at the clock thinking we don't really, but there's
just
coming in.
Anne has an interesting question for Tim about whether he has insight into why addressing inequalities isn't so clear in terms of the way forward. Are you able to do that in 30 seconds, Tim?
Yeah, well, I'm partly because I think it just didn't come out from the conversations that we've had in a clear way. So that it may be a product of that rather than a lack of clarity in its own right. But I think because it's been such a huge issue that's risen that that people are having to find their way. Well, what does that actually mean as a director of adult social care, for example, in terms of what should be our response? And obviously there is a big systemic, long established structural issues that will need to be addressed. But actually, what does that mean in terms of our care and support in relation to the different communities in our area? There are pockets, I think, of good practice, but not necessarily a more coherent approach to this. And I think this is where there is some opportunities playing this back into a corporate place-based approach.
Thank you. I think there's some really interesting questions coming in the chat around scaling. How could ABCD approaches be scaled up? Could it replace commissioning? And also questions around why is it that kind of bedded extra care apartments are being built when we're all saying we're trying to move away from this kind of institutionalization. So I think keep the questions in the chat coming in, because we will have time for some group discussions in a bit. I'm going to say let's take 5 minutes and go and have a cup of tea, because these kind of sessions are quite tiring. And then we will come back. We'll have one more presentation, then we will break into kind of more discussion groups where you can all hopefully pick up the conversations you've been having in the chat. But if we come back in kind of by 1:45, Sean, does that work for you? Yeah. So Andrew is kindly joining us from Northwest ADAS to talk through a report that they had commissioned for them. So yeah, without further ado, I will hand over to Andrew.
Hello, it's good to see everyone. I've been off work for 2 days. I've just been watching CNN constantly. It's been an absolute waste of my time. So it's quite nice to see a bunch of people I've not seen for a while. So hello everyone. My name's Andrew Burridge. I work for Northwest ADAS. So we have a regional programme office in the Northwest, like many of the regions. And we carried out a piece of work with an organisation called Clare's Centre for Local Economic Studies, I think, probably about 18 months ago, which we're really pleased with. So it's nice to go back and talk about it again. And I suppose thanks to Claire's and Mosley, who are on the call, Tom Lloyd Goodwin, guy at Claire's that worked with us, and Neil McInroy, who many of you might know and worked with us closely. I think Neil's just announced that he's leaving Claire's to take up another role. So I'm sure we'll still work with him in different ways. So I've got, right, first things first, let me put this in the chat. That's not worked. I will put in the chat after this a link to the report itself. We'll send it out afterwards. So why did we carry out this piece of work? In a lot of our work in the region back in 2017, we carried out this major review of our care markets. We captured absolutely masses of data about services for people with learning disability and older people services. Our DAS's directors were talking a lot about transformation in the future, but there was increasing instability in the market, and almost are we fiddling while Rome burns moment. Do we understand the basic makeup of what we spend? So we carried that out in end of 2017, and it produced such a lot of rich information about what we spend on those, what councils spend on those services. It gave us a real picture of the extent to which markets were being increasingly dominated by big providers, what CQC call brands sometimes, with complex ownership structures. Speaks a bit to what people were saying about this idea of extractive and generative, which I'll come back to. And it also kind of set out this tipping point moment of the need for councils to change what they were doing. I feel like in probably 15-20 years I've written this as a tipping point in various documents, but it was another compelling one of those where we were trying to work out to break even with different scenarios. What would we have to change? And we'd have to significantly reduce our spend in residential nursing care, or bed-based nursing care. So all this stuff around community alternative co-production was absolutely in line with what we were doing. So we did that piece of work, and it was useful. It informed how commissioners wanted to use data, but I suppose a year on, we weren't sure that we had a great response, and it was embraced nationally as a groundbreaking piece of work. We weren't quite sure that we'd had that embracing of the tipping point and transformation happening. So we'd come across Clare's as a really interesting organisation who these concepts of community wealth building and anchor institutions that have come up. So my understanding at that point was exactly what's been described. So ways in which local places can use the assets broadly, or public spending in more progressive ways to retain that spend in the area, in the place. In particular, how is your hospital or how is your university investing, and so on. So we talked to Claire's, and we wanted to do a piece of work that would go back to our markets data and work with the local authority. Think how could you explore community wealth building? Right, 1 second as I try to get up a slide or two. Where am I? Right, can you see that? Can you see community wealth building? Somebody, I can't see my face now, so someone can. Well, Sarah, you're the one that's up. Yeah, I can see you. So, yeah. Sarah, I can entirely get feedback from you from this point, visual feedback, so you can grimace or nod. So this idea of community wealth building, so using the combined powers of communities, businesses, institutions, the aim is to retain as much wealth as possible in the local economy and focus on businesses that are locally owned. So we wanted to extend that analysis of the market, in particular to look at the types of organisations. This was something that Claes was talking to us about. Actually, it was my question, as people were saying there, about what do you mean by a generative organisation? Well, can we be a little bit clear about what's the test, especially with extractive sounding like quite a negative thing? What's the test that makes you an extractive organisation versus generative? Is it possible to increase your spend with local generative organisations, and how would you go about doing that? So I hopefully now have. Is this big enough for people to see? It's not so big on my screen. Can you see that? So there's an example of where we were talking about generative organisations. Claes was saying, think about these sorts of ownership models. So insourcing, municipal enterprises, so maybe an arm's length organisation, mutually owned companies, worker ownership, e.g. cooperatives, community ownership, so community businesses, and then potentially local private ownership. So providers for profit, but supporting what they call a triple bottom line. So progressive, locally based ideals around the community and the environment and workers, alongside pursuits of profit. I think I have a slide here that I wanted to go to. Oh, so that was Claes described what their report was doing. So again, concepts like an activist position within the Social Care Commission. I'll come back to that concept. So the findings. What the first thing I'd say is that I think people should read this report. I'd in principle say that about a lot of work that I get involved with, but I would always say that, whereas I particularly mean it in this instance, where it's a report that thinks about 40 pages long. So it's it's not a one-page summary, but it's worth your time. It's worth reading and reflecting on what's in there. We think it's really good. It's bold, it's clear, and its starting point is that from a local authority point of view, commissioners can take a more active role in shaping markets. So it won't just happen. Commissioners can kind of be sort of nudged or inspired or cajoled into doing more in local markets. And it also recommends prioritising, ensuring that any providers that you work with are as locally generative as possible. So I mentioned the types of ownership models that we were talking about. And I think the other thing, there was some difference between us and Claes in the report. This is a report that we asked Claes to work on because we wanted some different thinking to challenge our views and our local authorities. So it's Claes's report. We've Northwest ADAS embraced the report, but it's sort of with them. So there are some slight notes where we differ. One of the things keeping in there. So it's important to acknowledge that the locally distinct nature of local authorities means that the blend might differ. So it's kind of up to you and your communities in that, and then people who receive care, what sort of organisation would be best placed to fit that model. Within the report, you also what's in there. There's 3 conditions that frame the tools that are then set out in the report. So it's almost say, if you want to get into this, here are 3 tests that you can use to understand if you're doing it correctly. And I'll read those out. Those are, so a bit of text here, but the first one is, as far as possible, commissioners and policymakers should be trying to minimise the presence of extractive providers, and instead,
can you make
1 second.
Yeah, brilliant.
All right, so we're using the whole. I'd not turned on to presentation mode. Right, you can see that then, can you? I'm sorry about that. Okay, so this first thing, recommendation that you should be minimising the presence of extractive providers and utilise local generative alternatives. The second is around transforming services to facilitate innovation and meet needs with increased community delivery. And the third was such a meaningful co-production. We thought co-production was such an important theme, and that previous presentation about ABCD and almost mindset that to run through the approach that local authorities take, how people understand commissioning, that we should have commissioning in particular. So the report itself, so it runs through the policy context and almost the CLES critique of the economy and what's been happening around adult social care. So austerity, the impact of as CLES described, outsourcing over a period of time, concerns about some of what was touched upon before about large organisations that might be servicing debt in particular. And that was a big difference between in our early piece of work. We did find a relationship, not a huge relationship. We found a relationship between better quality and lower cost with local, not-for-profit, small to medium organisations. So it was quite, an interesting thing to realise. So then think about what sorts of organisations you want to be working with in 5-10 years. And in some of our markets, for some councils, they might be extremely reliant on one national provider. There's a kind of nuance where I'm not sure our local authorities would describe those, all their providers or those providers as extractive. And within the Corona period, I'd say like everyone's been working bloody hard, and so there was a messaging thing where we kind of need to think about the concept more and how comfortable commissioners are, where they are unlikely to be changing tomorrow their spend profile. So how do they, what sorts of relationships do they want to have with the sorts of organisations they're currently commissioned with? So that was an interesting discussion with players and with our commissioners. So that's an interesting few pages to understand classification. Then a couple of case studies. So I'll just run through these two examples because I think they're interesting. 1 second. I'm trying to stop this and show you the report. So we worked with Knowsley. That's not come up. We worked with Knowsley to do the analysis, but we spoke to Wigan and Tameside about 2 pieces of work. So can you see this now? If this is a report, Sarah, can you nod if you can see an orange border? Yeah, thank you. So back in 2014, under the wider framework of the deal, so the Wigan deal was very much a kind of values-based approach to what that council set up to do in partnership with its citizens and its providers. So they had sort of relatively traditional 14 council-owned day services, which they felt were slightly outdated, and they wanted to have more flexible, better quality. So they decided to close 10 of the 14 day centres. They thought use of direct payments would be how much time? Am I okay to keep going for time if you want to? Can you? Because I will go on about this. So I would say anyone running this, give me a nudge time-wise. So they thought use of direct payments would be one of the ways in which you can make this happen. So it's a sort of theme in the report to think about how does the money affect the way in which these services are being paid, and having greater power, let's say, or choice and control from the person receiving the service would be a really important way to make micro enterprises, small organisations viable. The count this role, which is I think almost around. There's a metaphor around the iPhone of just providing the infrastructure for the people to come and place the apps in, which I quite like. So the council providing business support. So people who are facing redundancy, they worked closely with those people to explore how they could set up community interest companies. They had business support, which connected those people to grants, small grants, to enable them to create organisations. They were more flexible about use of redundancy payments and so on, and provided loans to some people. And those services have been set up, and that's seen as a success in Wigan. The example in Tameside.
Andrew, I'm sorry, I'm gonna jump in, and because I think we've got a handover to Clinton for the discussion bit. It's really, really interesting, and I whilst Andrew says it is a 40-page report, I think it is really, having read it, and having read a lot of reports, it is a very interesting one, and I think it really kind of connects stuff up for me anyway. And I think kind of there's a lot more questions coming out of this. I think Jenny put a really interesting one, kind of, I guess it's a challenge as much as anything to make sure that kind of people who are using services or accessing some additional support are in the heart of this, driving some of this, because I think sometimes we can get quite disconnected into kind of theoretical chat about how this could work.
Can I make three final points just quickly? What's in it? So this thing on the screen is an example of if you do the analysis locally. I know it's at the unhelpful angle, but you look at what you spend with these providers and think about as a proportion of all your spend, how much of it is with generative providers, and actually supportive accommodation in Knowsley, they do really well, but nursing, residential, interesting areas. At the end of the report, so under those three areas, there's a set of tools, which is where we say to councils where you start, in particular to think about co-production, working with people together. So it's things like social value in contracts. It's things like how do your social workers connect people to services? Do they understand different sorts of organisations? Are they comfortable moving people? Supporting people to work with different organisations. And then just the final thing is this was a great for us, and we before coronavirus happened, we were about to launch a whole program of work, which was to sort of a network of peers, commissioners, to think about how they do this stuff. We've also had TLAP come to our branch to talk what was described before, to talk about co-production. So it's something that's, I'd say it's a glimpse of the future. It's not an easy thing to work on. Unfortunately, I don't think the answer is, in this care market, put all of your spend into this type of organisation, and there's difficulties in supporting new entrants to market. But it's quite an exciting set of ideas that can help you move things on, I think.
There is so much coming through the chat, but we will record that, and we won't lose anything, because I think there's some fascinating discussion. One thing I did want to raise, it's been made a few times, is the importance of mixed communities. If we're talking about community, the trend towards communities where people with the same sorts of disabilities live together, or older people live together, that has some challenges, and we need to be thinking about that. Anyway, we're handing over to Clinton, who is managing the next discussion. Well done, Clinton. Susie, you've got a question slide, I think, to put up. That's nearly it. That was it. And are you managing the breakout rooms, Susie?
I'm going to try my best, John. Hopefully I'll just randomly assign everyone to breakout rooms. It would be great if in your breakout rooms someone could be kind of a bit of a note taker and email them over afterwards if we don't have the time to go through kind of full notes. Obviously, if Sian or I or someone is in the room, we will be those people as well. But Clinton, without any other stops from me and Sian, over to you.
Thank you, everyone. Very thought-provoking themes today, and some powerful reasons to bring the conversation together. Now the hard work is over to all the participants on this session to think about 3 questions, and those 3 questions are: what are the connections developing in your area between the emerging strategies for local economies, communities, and adult social care? The second question is, how do these connections deliver additional impact? And the third is, what do we need to do to foster greater connectivity between the conversations at a strategic level? So what we'll try to do is how we try and explain how we're going to manage this conversation. And I think Susie touched on it. We're going to break up into groups for discussions. I'd like to ask a volunteer note taker to take some notes and send them to either Sian or Susie. We've got 20 minutes for discussion, then we'll come back. Are we back together? Okay, great. we've just had a. No, am I still here?
Yep.
Okay. I don't know what's going on there. So I hope you had a really useful discussions. I'd just like to just get a flavour of some of the discussions. Can I go to Susie first in your group?
Sure, I'll keep it brief. We had some really interesting discussions, actually. I think a couple of things came through really clearly. Firstly, around kind of people and communities, that we, in all of these conversations, we need to make sure that kind of people, experts by experience, are central to all of these conversations, that actually what we're talking about is being driven by their strengths and what they need and what they want. And that we can't kind of lose that in all of these conversations. We also talked about kind of the need to influence commissioning and how that it can be a challenge when there's kind of commissioning cycles, but to shift to potentially kind of more locally rooted community kind of asset-based service provision and support. There needs to be investment in kind of infrastructure and those organisations to develop, and that local authorities need to take a market development approach to that. And we closed on what I think was a really interesting point, that a lot of probably social care teams don't necessarily have a really strong vision for future of care in their place, and that without that, you're not going to build the market development approach that is going to enable that to happen when you next come to a commissioning cycle. So it really needs to be built around this kind of vision for the future. And then the additional thing, which I think is an age-old question, and I don't think anyone's got the answer for it yet, is if you're investing over here in kind of different ways of doing social care, but half of the financial benefit is felt in the NHS, how do you balance that? And how do you kind of encourage someone who's outside your organisation to also kind of contribute to those things? And I think those are some of the big questions for this type of way of working, around like real kind of place-based work, and a bit around needing to build the economic model so we kind of prove the case without needing to prove it locally over and over and over again.
Thank you, Susie. Can I ask Sean to come in and just give us a flavour of discussions in your group?
I can. Thank you very much. We didn't actually feel we had the knowledge to answer the more complicated questions about what was going on, because most people in the group didn't have that kind of weren't working at that strategic level. But we had some really interesting conversations about the balance and the difficulty of maintaining the balance between community and public services in particular, and what was the right balance, which didn't leave communities feeling that public services were just walking away from their responsibilities, but also didn't mean that public services were moving into areas they shouldn't be in. So there was a quite long conversation about that. Azara, sorry, I got your name, pronounced your name wrong, talked very interestingly about family group conferencing as one of the tools that might enable people to talk together on a power neutral basis, where everybody in the room, professionals, families, independent coordinators, were at the same power level, and that allowed a different kind of conversation and different kind of solutions. And finally, we talked about the need for there to be conversations at all levels. So it's absolutely fine if the senior managers are having sparky conversations about linking things together, but that actually needs to make sense for the frontline social workers who have a responsibility to make sure that people's basic needs are met. And they also have had additional responsibilities during this period of lockdown to comply with the Coronavirus Act. So that has limited their ability to act. I think that's about it. Have I missed anything? Anybody? No?
And Sean, can I ask Neil from our group to just feedback some of the things from our discussion? Neil?
Muted, Neil.
Yep, sorry, unmuting. Yeah, we had some interesting examples of the involvement of disabled people's organisations and self-advocacy organisations during lockdown and before. So a colleague from Action for Disability Kensington and Chelsea, which within a mutual aid framework had run a volunteer project to support people during COVID with PPE prescriptions, to help people take part in online sessions. They'd had a loan scheme of iPads and people delivering those. And one of the sort of key points emerging out of that was the importance of disabled people being seen as and acting as agents of mutual aid and of community, not just as beneficiaries, which is a kind of fear I think some people have that could get lost, and community-based organisations just replicate the kind of charity models of old. So that was a key thing. We heard about an interesting initiative in the Wirral Evolutions, which were running a locally based restaurant which provided cheaper meals for people, was a place to meet, and the economic returns going back into the local community, this idea of bringing these threads together. And I suppose that raises a question about whether some existing infrastructure that out there could be developed and repurposed in the ways that we're talking about, whether they historically have been day centres that want to move into some different mode of operation. We had something really powerful though, which was one of our participants saying they'd felt much more isolated and disconnected from community in normal times than in lockdown. During lockdown, they had more access to people and activities online. Once it stopped in May, those connections went. So perversely, lockdown was potentially a more inclusive moment for many people. They'd been trying to foster local community themselves, but found that GDPR and data protection rules were standing in their way. They certainly couldn't do it with the partnership of the council, which is an obstacle others have mentioned. What they were doing positively though was trying to use Facebook to make those local connections. But it does raise a question about the balance between the idea of community as neighbourhood level and highly localised versus community online, which can be as geographically dispersed as you like, and where the importance is.
Thank you, Neil. There was a fourth one. I can't remember who was doing it. Mick, thank you.
I can do that, but I think other people might want to chip in. And I'm doing the questions in reverse order. So I think in terms of the strategic coming together, and this is a lot based on similarities between Leeds and Manchester, but I think you'll see them elsewhere. You know, one of the things that's really helped is that in the local economic strategy, inclusive growth strategy, becoming the best city for health and wellbeing is one of their core aims, because they know that that's good for the economy. And then similar within the health and wellbeing strategy, it includes having a strong economy with quality jobs based locally is one of the things we want for good health and wellbeing. So those two things being pulled together encourage more localised joint working and joint investment, etc. And that local thing is really key. Wendy spoke really articulately about some work they've done as part of the Nest 100-day challenge, which really had that strong focus on equality, local focus, using that to drive change. I think that's something you're seeing more and more. And then finally, when there's sort of the broader stuff, I mean, I was particularly saying that I think this is reflected a bit in Manchester as well and other cities, that this is still relatively new. If you'd have asked me a few years ago, there was very little connection between those in the council working on the economy and those working on social care. But that has changed. And for me, there's been two drivers, one of which is a recognition just on the sheer spend on both social care and also health. And it's worth noting that the joint work between health and care is a route in to the rest of the council and vice versa. So the fact that the NHS is the biggest employer in the city, you know, that has a massive economic impact. You know, the anchor organisations we talked about earlier, just things like med tech coming into the city. So there's a lot of interest in that, in the economic bit. But also, and I would say this, in Leeds, the inclusive growth strategy had a lot of criticism because the focus had been on growth and not so much on being inclusive. But then people begun to understand A, B, C, D, and then some of the other stuff that's been talked about today is a route for them to engage better in local communities and have stuff that is driven bottom up from local communities, but with a focus on economy. And those three things coming together, I think, have helped the journey, but we're doing that in a time of massive contradictions when there's other focuses on the economy, on the green sector, etc.
Thanks, Mick. Time's running out. Martin, over to you. to try and pull this together for next steps. You're on mute.
I'm not going to try and pull it together because there's 4 minutes left. I'm just going to say 2 minutes, and then I'm going to ask Susie and Sian about what next. So just to remind us that we're at a conference, we're in a festival called Social Care Future Towards a Brighter Future. So most of us are here are coming together because we want social care to be different. We're trying to achieve the social care future vision. We all want to live in a place we call home with the people and things that we love, and communities where we look out for one another, doing the things that matter to us. It's clear that that vision goes well beyond traditional ideas of social care, and it can't be achieved by the capacity and resources of social care. It's a vision for a good life for all, contributing to and supported within strong, prosperous communities. So those of us that are interested in that vision will have to engage with those people that are concerned about civil society and those people who are concerned about inclusive local economies. There's a massive prize for us to gain, and we won't be able to achieve our vision if we don't do that. The big question is, how do we do that? What are our steps? Thanks to Sian and Susie for bringing us together to start this conversation. And we're going to need to move it on. Social Care Future wants to support and be part of bringing those conversations together, not just from a kind of intellectual point of view, but from a point of view of what it means, what we can do at a local level, and what we need to influence at a national level. There's lots of stuff coming out that's useful. I put something in the chat around commissioning that we've been working on, around how you can commission differently in social care to move in this direction, and how you can encourage commissioners to do that. There's also interesting stuff going on, but I suppose I just want to make sure that Sian and Susie have a minute or two to offer their thoughts on, you know, what are we going to do after this really interesting chat then?
Go, Sian.
Yeah.
Well, all I was going to say is that there's a massive stuff in the chat and in the conversations that we need to absorb and reflect on. But what we had thought, and we agree with you, Martin, this is the start of a conversation, not the end of one. And we think, or we have thought, that it might be useful to bring together a group of people who are really interested in this, that is wider than the group that we have been talking to, Susie, to start to practically think about how do we at strategic and frontline levels start to bring all these conversations together to have better impact for people and communities. Is there anything else, Susie?
No, I think just thank you to everyone. It's been, I mean, the speakers, but it's all right, Sian. We'll do good top and tailing of it. But yeah, I think just there's a lot in there. I think Martin's right. This is not just an intellectual exercise, although that is a very interesting part of it. This is really about kind of how can we kickstart these conversations to drive change. And that's going to have to be at local and kind of national strategic levels. But thank you all. Sian and I are going to write something up after this and we will share it out. But yeah, let's keep the conversation going. And I think also there's some really exciting kind of glimpses of this stuff happening, and there will be more than we know about. So do keep us posted on other ones that are happening, because I think we can get to a kind of weight of enough examples that we can start really pushing for kind of larger scale change. But yes, thank you everyone. Thanks to all the speakers, and enjoy the rest of the festival.
Well, indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.